So we are on, and I'll try to talk a little bit louder. These units do make a little bit of noise, but hopefully you can hear me, and hopefully we'll manage it so that we don't get a lot of feedback. This is the last lesson in this series, Mind Your Faith. This is lesson 31. Even though there were only 28 lessons, we've decided to go and do the appendices because they are interesting. And so this is the last one, and the title of it is The Problem of Slavery. I really did try to get other people. I didn't really want to do this one, so I tried to get several other people to do this, and I didn't have any takers. So you're stuck with me. But just in review, we started this back in September. There have been 31 lessons. We've had 15 different teachers. Some of them had never taught in the auditorium before, and I think everyone that taught did a great job. And I hope that they weren't scarred by the experience. But I think everyone did great. I'm just really proud of us for being able to do something like that. I don't know if a lot of congregations would be able to do that. Let's see. I think I said all of that. So one of the things that we were trying to do is just to do one lesson per class period and just try to get through the whole thing. And I think at the very beginning, I think I did the first lesson, I asked, be considerate of the teacher, let them finish their topic. So I'm not saying don't say anything today, but I do have a lot of material. As a matter of fact, I think we could probably make a month's worth of lessons out of this topic, but we are not going to do that. We have today. Here, just on this book in particular, this particular study in apologetics, there are several other good books that if you want to continue sort of this study. Introduction to Christian Evidences by Farrell Jenkins. It's really sort of written in outline form, but there is a lot of good that you can get out of it. There are a lot of passages that are quoted. If you've never had the opportunity to hear Farrell Jenkins preach before, and I did when I was a kid, I did not go to Florida College, but he's just a fantastic teacher. This is a book written by non-Christians, Evidence That Demands a Verdict, Josh McDowell and his son, Sean McDowell. Outstanding book. It's very thick, very topically oriented. It's outstanding. This is also a very interesting book, The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel. Used to be an atheist, but brought himself to believing in God. So it's just a really interesting read if you want to read something like that. Why are we looking at slavery? And the short answer is it's in the book, but sometimes you run into people who try to discredit the Bible by saying that some aspect of its teaching is immoral, or at least it's kind of shady. So they critique the Bible by thinking that they can show if it's wrong about one concept, then it could be wrong about all of its concepts. And of course there is a fallacy in that argument, but the scriptures themselves claim to be God-breathed. When I'm pointing at that, I'm really pointing at that. God-breathed and profitable for correction, instruction, so that we can be the complete Christian that God wants us to be. So, what about slavery? Slavery, it's one of those issues that's been thoroughly rejected, I think, in the United States and in most of the world. Certainly we would consider in the civilized world it's not looked upon well, but even in what we consider the civilized world, there are pockets of what we would describe as slavery. Certainly in this country, slavery is rejected by a vast majority of the population. I would assume that it'd be somewhere in the 99% range, or the concept of the institution of slavery has been thoroughly defeated in rejection. And I say that, but there is a tendency to look at slavery as something of the past. But it's estimated today that over 27 million people in the world are still subject to some form of slavery, whether we call it forced labor, whether it's a sex trade sort of a thing, whether people, human beings, are treated as inheritable property, or anything like that. And so for us, that have been saved from the slavery of sin, as followers of Jesus Christ, we should really be outspoken people that condemn slavery and condemn the conditions that people are put under, and we should be advocating for the ending of human slavery in the world today. That would be a good thing for any Christian today. But the question does come up. Does the Bible not speak out? Why does the Bible not speak out strongly against slavery? Why does the Bible, in fact, seem to support the practice of human slavery? Some people would say that. I'm not saying that. Or at least this is the accusation that people would make. So what do we mean by the term slavery? We're going to go through different terms that are used. Not all forms of slavery were the same. And we can't associate every instance of slavery that's mentioned in the Bible, or bondage or servitude in the Bible, to the type of slavery that was practiced in North America during the 16, 17, and 1800s. They're not always exactly the same, so we need to keep that in mind as well. So here are some of the terms that's used in the Bible for slavery. Slave, obviously. Servant, bond servant, captive. Many times, of course, as the spoils of war, captives would be taken. Household slave or servant, sometimes the term handmaid is used, sometimes the term maidservant is used, and sometimes female slave or servant, or even freedman, which is a former slave, someone who had been a former slave. Some of the slaves that were mentioned in the Bible, think of some. Hagar, I'm sorry, this is so print, and we're not really going to go into this in detail. Hagar was a maidservant of whom? Sarah, right? Joseph, was Joseph a slave? Joseph was sold by his brothers into slavery into Egypt. The Israelites, of course, in Egypt, and you'll see in the Bible, this is referenced many times. I don't have an exact count, but of course, in some cases it's used as an example. God uses it. We use it as a figure of bondage and sin, bondage and slavery. And I tried to get AI to count how many times it's referenced in the Bible, and it said this is really difficult. But the answer is apparently somewhere between 150 and 270. So just depending on how ChatGPT or Grok references it. Onesimus, who's that? Slave of whom? Who did he belong to? Philemon, as people say. I hope it's not hard for you to hear me. It's a little bit hard for me to hear you. Let's see. I can't even read that. Ziba, who was that? So this is the servant of Saul's household, often interpreted as a slave. And this was somebody who served. Do you remember Saul had a son that was crippled in his feet? That was their name. And then the servant of God, the servant of Naaman's wife, who told Naaman to go to Israel to get cured of his leprosy. What about Jacob? Would you consider Jacob a slave? What did Jacob do? He made an agreement with Laban to work 7 years for Rachel. And then he had to work 7 more years for Rachel, right? After 7 years, he was given Leah, and then he was given... Yeah. In the context of some of what is called a slave or a bondservant, it would fit under some of those definitions. Maybe a liberal definition of it, but it would fit. So here's what I want to do is, because there is so much material, I don't want to leave you hanging at the end and just not get to everything. So what I want to do is kind of go through a summary of slavery in the Old Testament, and then I want to go through a summary of slavery in the New Testament. And then if we have time, we'll go through everything in a little bit more detail. So slave ownership was a common practice long before the time the Mosaic Law was given. So the law neither instituted slavery nor did it end it. Rather, the law regulated slavery, and it gave instructions on how slaves were to be treated, but did not outlaw slavery altogether. So several different forms of slavery that are referenced. And when I say slavery, I'm using it as a really generic term: bondservant, all of those sorts of things. Hebrews with Hebrew slaves, Exodus 21:2 says, when you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years, and in the 7th month he shall go out free for nothing. So there was an arrangement where you could buy someone's service for a period of time. There were also arrangements where you could sell yourself into being a bond servant for a period of time. And in some cases, I don't know if this was practiced so much in the Old Testament, but you could even say that some of the apprenticeship practices that were not what we traditionally think of as slavery were serving as a bondservant. Benjamin Franklin worked as an apprentice, as a printer in Boston before he ran away and opened up before the end of the term, and opened up his own printing press in Philadelphia. So you could consider that, when you were just working to learn and they were providing some needs for you, some sort of servitude. What else about Hebrews with Hebrew slaves? We're told, do not make them work as slaves. And that would be the type of slavery that the Israelites experienced down in Egypt. They are to be treated as hired workers or temporary residents among you. So besides that, the law also specified when you release them, do not send them away empty-handed. Supply them liberally from your flock, your threshing floor and your winepress. Give to them as the Lord your God has blessed you. Also, interestingly enough, the freed slave had the option of staying with his master. But if the slave plainly says, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out free, then his master shall bring him to God, and he shall bring him to the door or the doorpost, and his master shall bore his ear through with an awl, and he shall be his slave forever. That kind of creeps me out a little bit. But that was the process. And apparently from my reading of that, it could have been the case where this guy is ready to be released. He has served his years, but his wife and his children belong to his master, and he didn't want to leave them. So he was willing to, his master treated him well, which he was supposed to under the old law. And he did not want to leave. He was content to continue serving him. So that's what he did. Yes.
Are you saying that these type of slaves sold themselves, or in some cases were they sold by someone else?
If it was a Hebrew, they were not supposed to sell Hebrews themselves. So this would probably be someone who sold themselves into slavery. And it could be a situation where they got into debt to this person, and they couldn't repay it, and so to satisfy the debt, they bound themselves to a master for a period of time. No more than 7 years, because what was supposed to happen? The debts were supposed to be forgiven. They were supposed to be released.
So you're saying they weren't sold to them by somebody else?
In this case, that is right. Yeah. Yeah. You weren't supposed to do that with Hebrews. Hebrews were not supposed to sell other Hebrews. Let's see. There was also the case where there were Hebrews with Gentile slaves. And so here are the regulations that cover that. Your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. You may also buy some of the temporary residents living among you and the members of their clans born in your country, and they will become your property. You can bequeath them to your children as inherited property and can make them slaves for life, but you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly. Does that make a little more sense in how the Hebrews themselves internally were treated, and then how they were treated for people that were Gentiles that lived around them? You remember when the Israelites first came into the land of Canaan, and there was a group of people that came, they saw what the Israelites were doing to Jericho and some of the other places. And so what they did was they dressed up in ragged clothes and acted like they had come from a long way and sort of deceived Joshua into making a deal with them to not attack them. And you remember what their punishment was?
Wood bearers forever.
Yeah, so they would end up being servants of the Israelites for that. So that could be one of these situations that we're talking about right here. And you also have to remember that some of the people that lived around them were hostile toward the Israelites. And so it was pretty common practice back in the day for those people that you had defeated in battle, for you to defeat them in battle and then take some of them to be your servants or your slaves. There were standards for the way that you were supposed to treat these people as well. This is a different instance here. This is where a Gentile might own a Hebrew slave. And this would be if a stranger or sojourner with you becomes rich, and your brother beside him becomes poor and sells himself to the stranger or sojourner with you, or to a member of the stranger's clan, then after he is sold, he may be redeemed, or his brothers may redeem him, or if he grows rich, he may redeem himself. He shall calculate with his buyer from the year when he sold himself to him until the year of Jubilee, and the price of the sale shall vary with the number of years. The time he was with his owner shall be rated as time of a hired worker, and if there are still many years left. Anyway, you get the picture, that it was possible for a Hebrew to sell himself to a Gentile that was living amongst them, and to become a bond servant of that person. They could calculate, what their value was over time and then pay themselves off, or one of their relatives could redeem them if they wanted to as well. So, but the point is that this was not free play here. There was regulation on how all of this stuff was to work. Now, just because there's regulation on how this kind of stuff is supposed to work does not mean God loves this practice, that God is comfortable with this practice, that he likes this practice. It means he's trying to regulate it. And when we regulate something, what are we really trying to do? We're trying to protect certain classes of people, right? I'm not going to read through that one. That's just more of the laws about those people that sell themselves to Gentiles when they're Hebrews. But here are some of the rights that are granted to slaves under the law of Moses. First of all, you had the right to keep a wife. These are all from Exodus 21. Had the right to keep a wife, verse 3. The right not to be sold to foreigners, verse 8. The right to be adopted into a family by marriage, verse 9. The right to food and clothing, verse 10. And the law also limited masters in their use of corporal punishment. Okay? So this was not a, hey, you didn't make enough bricks today, so I'm going to beat you. So there were limits on what you could do. So this was how slavery or servitude was regulated under the old law. Slavery in the New Testament. Even in the New Testament era, the Bible does not demand that every slave owner immediately emancipates his slaves. However, the apostles gave instructions to slaves and their owners on godly behavior within that social construct. Masters were admonished on the proper treatment of their slaves. For example, in Ephesians 6, the end of verse 8 and to 9, whether he is a bondservant or is free, masters do the same to them. Treat them with goodwill. And that's my emphasis there. Do the same is reflecting back to verse 7, I think. And stop your threatening, knowing that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no partiality with him. In other words, one of the things that Paul is saying is God looks at you and your master's souls the same way. The master's soul is not more valuable than the slave's soul. Jesus died for everybody. He died for the slave. He died for the master as well. So treat each other accordingly. In Colossians, something similar, masters, provide your slaves with what is right and fair, because you know that you also have a master in heaven. So it's very similar language there. So Jesus and the apostles did not outright condemn slavery here, but they didn't need to, or that certainly wasn't the focus of the gospel anyway. The effect of the gospel, the effect of the teaching of Jesus changes lives. One by one, those changed lives, in turn being transformed entire families, it transformed communities, it transformed cultures. And it really was the ideas behind Christianity that ended up putting an end to slavery, I think, in the modern world. You've had people like William Wilberforce in England, who certainly considered himself a Christian and used the Bible, and some pretty clever legislative tricks to eliminate slavery in the British Empire. And of course, that was done without going to war, although a lot of people were really mad at him about it, whereas we ended up having to fight a war really to eliminate slavery in our country. Christianity was not really ever designed to be a political movement, but over time it naturally did affect political policy. Alexander MacLaurin, a Scottish theologian, wrote that the gospel meddles directly with no political or social arrangement, but lays down principles which will profoundly affect those and leaves them to soak into the general mind. So within the Bible itself, though, we do see seeds of what we could call emancipation. Genesis 1:27, so God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. And Acts 17:26, depending on which version you're looking at, it says that God made man of one blood, or God made all of us of one man, is the thought there. So the way that we have to look at this is God made black people, he made white people, he made brown people, he made yellow people, he made, what did I leave off? Everyone the same. We have the same soul. We all look a little bit different, but he made us all the same. Also, Exodus 21:16, whoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone found in possession of him shall be put to death. What happened to Joseph? Kind of stole the brother and sold him into slavery, right? So under of course, this law of Moses was not in place then, but you know, in the view of God, such a person should be put to death. So stealing someone to put them into slavery, this is what God thinks about that. Also in 1 Timothy 1:8, now we know that the law is good if one uses it lawfully, understanding this, that the law is not laid down for the just, but for the lawless and disobedient, for the ungodly and sinners, for the unholy and profane, for those who strike their fathers and mothers, for murderers, the sexually immoral, men who practice homosexuality, enslavers, liars, perjurers, and whatever else is contrary to sound doctrine. So let me just suggest to you that you don't want to be found amongst that list of people right there. So enslavers are explicitly condemned here in 1 Timothy chapter 1. So some people criticize the Bible because it did not demand an immediate overthrow of every ingrained, centuries-old, sinful custom of the day. But as one person pointed out, the Lord chooses to change people and society gradually through the ministry of the Holy Spirit, and the proclamation of the truth of the Word of God can change cultures as well. Slavery existed in the Bible, and the presentation of slavery in the Bible is, it is somewhat complex. But it's less complex if you bear in mind what the focus of the Bible is, that it's on the salvation of souls, and it's not justice in this world. If that's what you're holding out for, is justice in the world, you're going to be sadly disappointed, because that is just not going to happen. It's not to say that someone's not going to get justice, but that is not what this world was created about. It's not built that way. Let's go through some of the things that are mentioned in, yes, here's another one. With the seeds of emancipation, forgot I put this in here. Of course, Philemon. You remember the story here, Onesimus and Philemon. Onesimus was a slave or a bondservant to Philemon, and had apparently run away and found his way to Paul. And we don't know exactly what the circumstances were. They could have met each other in prison. Don't really know, or could have been somewhere else. But it seems that Onesimus became acquainted with Paul. We don't know whether it was when he met Philemon or maybe it was later on, but he was converted. He became a Christian. And Paul does not say, well, okay, well, you're emancipated now. Paul considers him under the control of Philemon, because he apparently had some sort of an agreement, or he was considered property of Philemon. But Paul sends Onesimus back to Philemon and tells Philemon, you treat him right, you treat him like a brother in Christ, because that's what both of you are. So no longer as a bondservant, but more than a bondservant, treat him as a beloved brother, especially kind of interesting. Read through Philemon, it's very short. Paul seems to be calling in some chips on Philemon here, that perhaps Philemon owes Paul a favor. But anyway, good principle there that we find. That is how we're supposed to treat our fellow Christians. And if we have made a legal arrangement with somebody to be their servant for a period of time as a Christian, we should complete that arrangement. So here are some other considerations about slavery. When sin entered the world, relationships became distorted. Slavery was not created by God. That was created by man. Okay? So there is no endorsement of slavery by God. You cannot find a place where God says this is a good plan. It does not present a world in which God intended people to be owned. It certainly doesn't depict a world where God intended people to be abused by other people. And the reason doesn't matter whether it's because of race or sex or any other reason. God did not create a world for slavers or other abusers of human beings. People that try to use slavery as a way to discredit the scriptures are missing the bigger picture. Salvation and deliverance from sin, that is God's main focus. And so some of these laws that came along to regulate slavery are not endorsing it, they're just trying to control it. Now, what does Jesus do when he talks about marriage? When he resets marriage, he goes back to the beginning. This is what it was supposed to be like. Remember, we talked about that. Has it been a couple of years now? He refers back to Genesis, how things were in the beginning. That's how those relationships got distorted over time with divorce and people divorcing for basically any cause or wanting to get divorced for any cause. So the same thing with slavery. I don't think it was ever intended for humans to own other humans or for anyone to abuse anybody else, but there was a regulation to keep it from being worse. Polygamy is another example of that. God allowed it, tried to control some of the abuses in it at some point, but it certainly never indicates that, that's my 10-minute warning, that since we have no clock, that God supported that idea or that it was a good idea, which is really the second point that I got to. God allowed certain actions that he later prohibited, modified, or regulated differently, such as marriage, such as polygamy. 1 Corinthians 7 tells us, were you a bondservant when called? Do not be concerned about it, but if you can gain your freedom, avail yourself of the opportunity. For he who was called in the Lord as a bondservant is a freed man of the Lord. Likewise, he who was free when called is a bondservant of Christ. You were bought with a price. Do not become bondservants of men. So, brothers, in whatever condition each was called, let him there remain with God. And I think the lesson there is you can be a servant of God whether you're in servitude or whether you're free. Paul says, hey, if you can get your freedom, yeah, do it. So just to reemphasize, what God permitted to happen when sin entered the world and what God desired from the beginning are not necessarily the same thing. God's design for the beginning of people was different than that. What we have through Jesus is a reversal, a renewal process. Matthew 19, he gets back to the design, one man, one woman, no divorce, and the new law, the new covenant is built around the idea of freedom. You can't get away from that. Freedom mainly from the bondage of sin, but I think it indicates being owned or oppressed by others as well. That's what God ultimately wants for his creation. Sometimes God regulates a less than desirable practice for the purpose of protecting those who may otherwise be easily abused. And that was certainly the case with some of these laws that we've seen on slavery. It's certainly the case with how you were supposed to treat your wife, how you were supposed to treat your fellow man. I'm going to have to go through some of these pretty quickly. Let's see. We have to distinguish between the different types and the kinds of slavery that there were. There were indentured servants, and this would be when someone sold themselves either for money or they sold themselves to repay a debt. That's normally what that is. Sometimes there were servant girls. There were laws, actually, and just don't have time to go through them. We could spend an entire lesson on this, where servant girls could be qualified for future wives, sometimes as concubines. Can you think of some servant girls or women in the Bible that are referred to? Mentioned one of them earlier, Hagar, Bilhah, Zilpah. These were servants of Rachel and Leah. They bore children to Jacob. The children of those servant girls or concubines, or however you want to refer to them, received inheritance just like the other children did they not? Anyway, that's a whole interesting study in and of itself right there. Sometimes foreigners were slaves. We've already talked about that. Captured people, sometimes spoils of war. But the laws were regulatory to deal with relationships distorted by sin, but the ideals were also built into the law that these people were not to be abused, not to be mistreated. So what happens if you find yourself in a situation where the ideal has been broken and you've sinned? Consider what John wrote. My little children, I'm writing these things to you so that you may not sin. But if anyone does sin, we have an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ the righteous. This is one of the verses that Doug brought up last week. So is John advocating for sin here? If you sin, it's okay, you've got an advocate. It's no big deal. So of course not, that's not what he's saying, but he is recognizing the reality of sin. He's recognizing that we're all sinners and that it's been dealt with by Jesus. And this is hope that as far as a Christian goes when he sins, not that the sin is acceptable, but that Jesus has provided a way to forgiveness. So if anyone sins, we have an advocate, Jesus Christ himself. So just as God is not advocating divorce, in Deuteronomy chapter 24, he did provide laws applying to divorce, even though divorce was not condoned, it was not ideal. In the same way, slavery was a reality at the time, so God imposed some regulations to help mitigate against further abuses and against a protection. If everyone loved their neighbor as themselves, wouldn't that make a huge difference in the world today? We would not need regulations. We would not need laws. We don't build prisons to condone criminal activity. We build prisons to protect the innocent, to protect those people from being abused. And I'm rapidly running out of time here, so there's just a couple other things that I do want to look at. One of the things that you have to remember is that the Greco-Roman culture back at the time was not a culture that was Christ-like. Slavery was rampant as a very common practice, especially in Roman culture. Christians had to deal with the reality of the times. A lot of there's verses in Ephesians, verses in Colossians that deal with how bondservants are to be treated. I'm not going to read those because I just don't have time. We talked about Philemon and Onesimus. I thought I wouldn't get to that, so I kind of did that ahead of time. Correct way for Christians to treat each other. Put on then as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience, bearing with one another, and if one has a complaint against another, forgiving each other as the Lord has forgiven you, so you also must forgive. And above all these things, put on love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony. Let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, to which indeed you were called in one body, and be thankful. If we treated everyone, if we treated especially our fellow Christians like that, there would be no problems, even if there was a servitude sort of relationship. The New Testament repudiates slave trade. There is an affirmation of the equal spiritual status of both free and enslaved peoples, Galatians 3:28. Slaves are encouraged to gain their freedom if possible. And the condemnation of the slave trade is depicted even in Revelations chapter 18, verses 11 and 13. So lastly, here's what I want us to look at real quickly is, as servants of Christ, this is what Jesus says, how we should view our service to Him. Because we're bondservants of His. We should be slaves to Christ. Will any of you who has a servant plowing or keeping sheep say to him when he has come in from the field, come at once and recline at table? Will he not rather say to him, prepare supper for me and dress properly and serve me while I eat and drink, and afterward you will eat and drink? Does he thank the servant because he did what was commanded? The implied answer is, of course not. So you also, when you have done all that you were commanded, say, we are unworthy servants. We have only done what was our duty. That's how we should think of our service. We're doing our duty. We're doing what is required of us. And in terms of, I found this really interesting. I'm reading through the Gospels and I just ran across this yesterday by accident. And this was the scripture from Isaiah that when Jesus was really starting off his public ministry, he goes into the synagogue on the Sabbath in Nazareth, takes the scroll, and he reads this passage here. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has appointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Now, obviously, the bigger picture here is freedom and liberty from sin, but you can't help but not see the parallel issue here of freedom and slavery for humans, right? I got 5 seconds. What you got?
Not necessarily on your comment there.
Not what?
Not necessarily on your comment about that line.
Do you not agree with that?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
I know the context is sin and redemption.
The context is sin. You do not see it as having a larger application as well?
Now, Jesus didn't raise an army.
No, certainly not. Certainly not. But is he telling us how we should treat other people? Not oppress them? Have them at liberty? Slave trade has been condemned? People are to be treated kindly?
What's good news? What was the good news up there?
Absolutely. That is definitely, but do you not see the overtones? Undertones?
Not unless you make it.
Okay. That's fine. I do see them. But I'll not force that opinion on you.
Now, what's left out of this book in that chapter?
What's left out of that book?
There's no indication about Portugal and Islamic participation in slavery. Way after Britain gets out.
Islamic? No, the Bible does not address. Islam did not come about until about 600, 700 years later. So yeah, it does not cover anything like that.
Major in the slave trade.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. There were a lot of, that was one of the reasons that the United States built a navy originally, was because of the slave off the Barbary Coast in North Africa. And it was mainly run by Muslims. Yeah.